Misthological Models Part 5, A Panoramic View of New Jerusalem. Chapter 7, New Jerusalem as the Bride. Dillow's synecdoche bride. Dillow poses that the bride is composed of all believers, but only faithful believers will be clothed in white. In short, he thinks the clothed part is a synecdoche, using this part of the bride to include the rest of the body of Christ as part of the bride of Christ. So here's the synecdoche, the white part. Supposedly, per Dillow, John uses this to include the whole church, although he refers only to the part clothed in white. John refers to the bride being clothed in white. Dillow says that this refers to the whole bride. However, since the number of believers who overcome is much smaller than the total number of believers, this means the Dillowian synecdochal bride is only clothed in a synecdoche bikini. Only the faithful portion of the bride would be clothed. The unfaithful portion would be unclothed. But the Bible presents the bride as beautifully clothed, not partially clothed. So Dillow's synecdoche fails for this reason. It also fails because it does not acknowledge two separate corporate bodies. Dillow's singular body and singular head. Since Dillow rejects the distinction between Christ's bridal body and federal body, this results in him only acknowledging one corporate body. Christ does not have a separate body, speaking corporately. Christ is a singular head, so the bride does not have a separate head. Again, there's no separate body, there's no separate head. Per Dillow's model, there are not two bodies but one, not two heads but one. So what is the result of Dillow's model, which poses only one head and one body? So let's clear these notes out over on the right and put the parts together that are left. One head, one body, and the bride is the synecdoche. The picture of the Dillowian one head, one body composite bride is mythologically blasphemous. Frankly, what Dillow poses is not only mythologically abhorrent, it is also impossible. As noted in previous discussions, you cannot marry your own body. Dillow is thus imposing an impossibility. So here is the picture of Dillow's composite bride with his synecdoche. In Dillow's model, the bride of Christ and body of Christ refer to the same entity. If that is the case, then Christ should be pictured as the head of the singular body, since Christ is the head of the church. The absurdity of this picture, however, is apparent from Paul's context. The husband is the head of the wife. Obviously, Paul does not mean that we should take the husband's head and place it on the wife's body. Two separate bodies are posed. The husband has his own body, and the wife has her own body. Yet Dillow's discussion has nullified that possibility at the metaphorical level. Dillow's position leads to the composite bride thus pictured. Here is my Misthological bride. Contrastively, in my two-body, two-head model, the bride is fully clothed in white because only faithful believers will compose the bride. So the bride is pictured on the left, the federal body of Christ is pictured on the right. The heavenly city is the bridal canopy. So the city being represented by the canopy. As in Revelation 19:7-9, the bride in Isaiah has prepared herself with the righteousness of godly living and faithfulness, and she will be rewarded for doing so. The bride has to make her own clothing. Both Isaiah 61:10 and Revelation 19:7-9 picture the bride of Christ. She clothes herself with the righteous deeds that her bridegroom makes possible. The earthly Mount Zion points to the heavenly Mount Zion, that is, to the reward city. The rulership exercised by the city will be over all the earth and thus spread throughout the universe. Here's a picture of the city, New Jerusalem, in a biosphere. Apparently, the throne of God will be at the top of the city, from which the river of life proceeds and flows down the side of the city, presumably to the new earth by means of portals. The city will be called Mount Zion in Scripture and will resemble the shape of a large mountain with rivers of life flowing down its sloped sides. Even if the city were on earth, as many suppose, Since the low-flying satellites, such as space shuttles and space stations, fly at an altitude of only 100 to 300 miles, it is apparent that most of the surface area of that city would project far into outer space, since the city is 1,500 miles high, and would be uninhabited by creatures living in natural bodies. Nevertheless, it appears that the entire surface area of the city is inhabitable, Isaiah 65:25, given that the water is not frozen solid but flows down these slopes, and that plants such as the tree of life grow on these slopes. It must be deduced that the city is encapsulated in a biosphere that supports life. Posing that the living water reaches Earth by means of portals allows the proposition that the city remains in a satellite position. Let's take the text in Revelation 21:7 through 8, color-code it, then lay it down and show the overlap. Yellow is Mistholic, blue is soteric, green is dualistic. Revelation 21:7 on the left, he who overcomes shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. That text is Mistholic. It deals with rewards. The text on the right, Revelation 21:8. But as for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake of fire that burns fire and brimstone, which is second death. This is soteric. Let's do a yellow overlay. We'll use the portion on the left to do so. Overlay that on the right. Yellow plus blue equals green. The green is not a mixed color, but a layer color. So let's look at this again. Here's the chart. As explained in Misthological Models Part 2, the antithetical juxtaposition in Revelation 21:7 through 8, again color-coded in green because it has both soteric and Mistholic information, is between faithful believers in verse 7, which is yellow being Mistholic, and unbelievers in verse 8, which is blue being soteric. Verse 8 technically is not a metaphorical picture of subcomers being hurt by the second death. Nevertheless, in terms of my secondary correlative application, verse 8 does provide a metaphorical picture of subcomers being hurt by the second death. So there's a picture of that overlay. Verse 8 is blue. That is soteriological. It deals with salvation from eternal damnation in the lake of fire as it pertains to unbelievers, which is its proper interpretation. And secondarily, green, that is Misthological, as it pertains to unfaithful believers, which is its correlative application. So here's a picture of this correlative outer darkness. In accordance with my principle of correlativity, verse 8 does not make this application to unfaithful believers directly, but indirectly, not merely millennially, but emphatically internally. Verse 8 is to be interpreted literally, not metaphorically. Just as unbelievers are literally excluded from the city in the lake of fire outside the heavenly realm, so unfaithful believers are literally excluded from the city in the celestial outer darkness in the outer realm of the heavenly realm. The realm of their exclusion is different, but the duration of their exclusion is the same, forever. In other words, just as unbelievers are literally cast from their place of judgment at the great white throne into the lake of fire, which is outside the city, unfaithful believers are literally cast from their place of judgment outside into the celestial outer darkness, which is also outside the city. For the purposes of the present illustration, I am using a truncated pyramid, thus ziggurat, on Earth in the form of the 3D city to represent the terrestrial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, abbreviated in the illustration as TZ-NJ, terrestrial ziggurat, New Jerusalem. Even if terrestrial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, TZ-NJ, is not in the shape of a ziggurat, it will probably have a ziggurat within it to access the 3D space city above it via teleportation. The earthly Jerusalem will basically be a miniature copy of the heavenly Jerusalem. Regardless, heavenly Jerusalem will be a truncated pyramid, thus ziggurat, space city in the second heavens, that is outer space, and thus can be referred to as the spatial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, SZNJ. The cubical celestial New Jerusalem, CCNJ, will be in the third heavens, the celestial heavens. Terrestrial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, T, Z, and J, will be approached by the nations by coming up on the broad plain of the earth to surround both, 1, the camp of the saints, and 2, the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Revelation 20, verse 9. I pose that this fire is from heavenly Jerusalem. The earthly forces will be coming up to attack both the terrestrial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, on earth, and the spatial ziggurat, New Jerusalem, that's in orbit above it. In response, heavenly Jerusalem will destroy the land forces and aerial forces through a scalar energy beam. Satan has already revealed his game plan in the movies. In both Star Wars and Independence Day, the way you destroy the superior mothership is to get inside its force field and destroy it from within. Satan will attempt to do this with the heavenly city. His plan will fail. I've color-coded the royal wedding in Psalms 45, 6 through 15. Let's explain the colors. This psalm describes a royal wedding. 4 principal participants are noted and 1 auxiliary group. The groom is referred to as God. That would be Elohim, King and Lord. The groomsmen are referred to as his male companions, his fellows. The bride is referred to as queen, daughter, princess. The bridesmaids are referred to as daughters of the king, her ladies of honor, her virgin companions. You see that both the groomsmen and the bridesmaid are both color-coded in green. They're the male and female counterparts of one another. The wealthy are referred to in an auxiliary capacity as people of Tyre, the richest people. To explain the color coding, Jesus is the God-man, the supreme Elohim with the capital E, who is represented by the groom. Human bridal gods and goddesses are second-class Elohim, represented by the bride. Faithful believers will compose the bride, and they will be gods and goddesses, but they will be second-class Elohim. High-ranking angelic gods and goddesses are third-class Elohim, and they attend as male and female companions. Again, as I noted, they're color-coded in green. So let's read the text up at the top. Your throne, O God, Elohim with a capital E, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of righteousness. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, capital E, your God, capital E, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your male companions. That would be the fellows. Being green denotes the high-ranking angels. Returning now to talking about God, referring to Jesus, your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory palaces stringed with instruments you make glad. Now we turn to green, and this is the daughters of kings are among your ladies and companions. Talking about high-ranking female angels. Now we go to blue, which we describing the bride. At your right hand stands the queen in the gold of Ophir. So this would be describing the bride of Christ being dressed in gold. Hear, O daughter, the queen being addressed, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Talking about Jesus desiring the beauty of his bride. Since he is your Lord, bow to him. Now we just have text that is in white, not color-coded. This will be the auxiliary people that we refer to below with the dot. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people. Now we return to talking about the bride. All glorious is the prince's inner chamber, with robes interwoven with gold. In many colored robes, she is led to the king. Now we return to talking about high-ranking female angels, being described with her virgin companions following her. With joy and gladness, they are led along as they enter the king's palace. High-ranking angelic gods will rejoice with the bride in her wedding. but the bride has a more elevated status than they. She is the one marrying the groom, the bride of Christ, being pictured here as the queen, the daughter, marrying the king. In this chart, I've juxtaposed the millennial wedding with the eternal wedding. On the left, we see the groom. This would be the uppermost class Elohim. That's our triune God, Father, Son, Spirit, God, immortal, God with all capital letters. Below this, we have a lower class Elohim, the bridal goddess, first class human Elohim. They are described in Revelation as overcomers. They will be gods and goddesses. They will be immortals. As we proceed down the chart, we also see groomsmen and bridesmaids. These are lower class Elohim, male and female angels, gods and goddesses with a lowercase g. They are also immortals. And below these, in the brown, we see rich attendees bringing riches. These are non-Elohim, Terran kings and queens. These would be mortals and Twilight Zone immortals. As we look at the right, as humanity continues spreads in eternity, the bridal goddess will have subsequent relatives, second-class human Elohim, lower class E, not co-equal. They will be gods and goddesses. They are not co-equal with the bride. They will be gods and goddesses with a lowercase g. And they will be immortals. Then below these, you'll have the rich bringing riches into the city. These will be non-Elohim. These will be Terran kings and queens, mortals, and Twilight Zone immortals. And again, this chart is just a brief overview of material explained much more in depth in the book, such as the difference between mortals, immortals, and smortals. See the book, Misthological Models, Part 5, for in-depth discussion. We are just doing brief summations. In view of the present study, the question arises as to whether second-tier human Elohim would be superior or inferior to third-tier Elohim composed of high-ranking angels. Will all human gods and goddesses outrank all angelic gods and goddesses? We know that not all faithful angels qualify to be on the divine council. Angels vary in rank among themselves. God did not create all angels equal. He placed the higher order of their number, such as archangels, in positions of authority over lower orders of their angelic counterparts. Likewise, not all bridal believers will have the same rank relative to one another, though they will be higher in rank than the highest ranking angels. Consequently, we can infer that second-tier human Elohim will, 1. Vary in rank relative to one another, 2. All be in lower rank than the lowest ranking first-tier human Elohim, 3. All be in higher rank than the highest ranking Terran king, and 4. Probably vary in rank compared to angels. And again, this is explained much more thoroughly in the book. Infinite growth of the human population will result in a need for infinite Terran access to the 3D space city from all regions of space. Accordingly, infinite 3D space cities will need to be scattered through all regions of space. An infinite number of gods and goddesses will be needed to administer the commerce flowing through these 3D space cities. The working theory advanced in Misthological Models Part 5 is that the 3D space cities are 3D teleportal cities that have immediate teleportal access to the 4D celestial city, which serves as the hub for all the 3D cities. Let's look at the 4D universe and 4D city. Some might pose that an infinite number of human Elohim might have an infinite number of residences in that 4D city. However, the 4D city cannot contain infinite 4D space or residence. The possibility of infinite internal space would be limited to 3D space. You can have universes inside the 4D city. However, I would further postulate that these internal universes are 3D. In my assessment, the multiverse is a 4D universe filled with finite 4D hyperspace containing a limited number of 3D universes. Likewise, the 4D city houses an unlimited number of 3D universes. Both the 4D universe and 4D city can accommodate unlimited 3D spaces. Additionally, this 4D universe is probably capable of infinite increase in its 4D capacity of internal 4D hyperspace, thus accommodating an infinite growth in the number of 4D residences as the number of 4D human Elohim increases throughout eternity. But the same does not appear to be true of the 4D city. It does not expand eternally. Therefore, the 4D city contains a limited amount of 4D hyperspace. McGee believes that New Jerusalem is a cubical city within a sphere. McGee states, "My thinking is that we will live inside the sphere, not on the outside. Here on earth, we live on the outside, and that presents a few difficulties. The Lord had to make the law of gravity to hold us on earth, or we would be flying into space. We walk on the outside here, but I think that we will walk on the inside of New Jerusalem." So here is a picture of the city as McGee would present it, and he believes that we will walk on the inside of the sphere. If we can walk on the inside of the sphere, then it must have gravity pulling outside away from the city. I concur that New Jerusalem will be within a sphere. Even if the outer sphere is not needed for offsetting gravity, it might be needed to allow the city to travel at speeds in excess of the speed of light. After all, the city is a spaceship. In any case, the sphere would be needed for various other purposes. One, it's needed as a biosphere, as we've already mentioned, allowing the tree of life to live on the outside of the city and the water of life to flow down its walls, etc. The sphere also serves as a time bubble, serving as a time displacement sphere. And the sphere also serves as a force field, protecting the city. Spherical pyramid or cube. On the left, we have the picture of the spherical pyramid, and the cube within the sphere is pictured in the middle and right at two different orientations. The spherical pyramid SP is of course smaller than the spherical cube 1, SC1. They are drawn to scale relative to each other's internal dimensions, representing a city that is 1,500 miles square at the base and having a height of 1,500 miles. Spherical cube SC2 has been rotated to the orientation provided by McGee for better visualization of the points of the city touching the sphere. Both the SC1 and SC2 are the same size. Although I prefer the spherical pyramid SP model, which is the smaller model, ample space is still available in the pyramidal city, as shown by my computations within my books. We'll briefly look at these computations here. Here we have the truncated square pyramids of China. You have the New Jerusalem Pyramid of China on the left and another Great Pyramid of China on the right. Since I pose that the Bema Stadium is at the top of the city, postulating some calculation for the square footage at the top of the city, at the top of New Jerusalem, will be necessary. If the Great Pyramids of China hint at the actual dimensions of the truncation, then postulating a truncation of 400 by 400 for the top of New Jerusalem seems like a reasonable estimation. So I'm posing that the truncated top of New Jerusalem is 400 miles by 400 miles. The pyramid pictured is labeled by Krieger as the New Jerusalem of China. The proposition of the square footage of the flat top to the rest of the pyramid appears to be roughly the same in both pictures. So the top appears to be taking about 1/3 of the area across, and estimating that this will be similar proportions for the Bema. The truncation of both pyramids seems to be a little less than 1/3 of the width of the pyramid. A third of 1,500, since the city is 1,500 miles across at the bottom, will be 500. So I am being very conservative and using a low number by rounding down to 400 for the Bema atop New Jerusalem. Here's another possible model for the truncated square pyramid using the pyramid of the sun. So there's a side view and there's the top view. A conservative estimate also seems to be prudent, since the pyramid of the sun would have a top that appears to be about 1/6 of the width of the base. For the sake of computation, let us suppose that the dimensions at the top of the heavenly city for the truncated pyramid are 400 by 400 square miles, and that the stadium spans that entire area. How many people could the Bema seat? Using the above computational procedure, it appears that it would be 446 billion plus people. Dillow was thinking much too small. The seating capacity for the rectangular tables served at the smallest part of the city, that is the Bema at top, would accommodate over 446 million people. There is plenty of room for the Bema to accommodate as many as is necessary atop New Jerusalem for the Bema judgment, for marriage supper, etc. My calculations assume that the city is the shape of a truncated square pyramid because, along with many others, I believe that the description of the city as a mountain makes this pyramidal shape the preferred model. Many others, however, prefer the cubical model, in which case the city would have much more room than I have calculated. Krieger insists that the pyramidal and cubical models should be combined, stating, reconciling the mountain of the Lord object with the cubed New Jerusalem, one can only conclude that somehow it is both, that is, multidimensional. So by appealing to its multidimensional nature, Krieger says that somehow it is both pyramidal and cubical. I concur, and in my book I give possibilities as to how that might be. We can reason by way of analogy. Here's a two-dimensional cross-section of a 3D cube. Given that WH, that is the writer of Hebrews, is emphasizing this relationship by saying that the 3D tabernacle is a copy and shadow of the heavenly city, one might think that he is hinting at its 4D dimensionality. Shadow in this context means to be bound to and dependent on the solid body which cast it, and copy means the earthly copy of the heavenly realities or possibly a sketch of them, as in Ezekiel 42:15. The above material is an abbreviated extract from Misthological Models Part 1 that provides a computational and 3D, 4D review. The advanced consideration being added here in Misthological Models Part 5 is to propose that the 4D city can have more than one 3D copy or shadow. As we know, a 3D object can have multiple shadows if it has multiple light sources, plus it can easily be copied many times. Thus, the biblical imagery suggests that the 3D city can be replicated, copied. Here's a 3D, 4D view of 2D, 3D. What would a spherical 3D universe look like to 4D gods or goddesses living in the 4D city? These 4D gods or goddesses would be able to see the entire 3D universe. And to remind you, the 4D gods or goddesses would be, for example, the bride of Christ, if they're 4D. To illustrate, consider the 2D flatlanders, Joe and Mary, in the left part of the illustration, who live in a rectangle in 2D flatland and are separated by a wall. In the illustration, would Joe be able to see Mary? So there's my question. Can Joe see Mary? And I have noted that there's a wall between them. No, there's a wall, so Joe cannot see Mary. Mike can see Mary because Mike is up above them and has a 3D vantage point of their 2D reality. But Joe cannot see Mary because of the wall, and that wall separates them in their 2D reality. For that matter, even if the wall were removed, Joe would only be able to see Mary's outer rim. He would not be able to see that she is pink inside. Likewise, Mary would not be able to see that Joe is blue inside. On the other hand, Mike is a 3D being who can see both Joe and Mary, since he is outside their rim, though they are accessible to his rim. The wall is no hindrance to Mike seeing them both. Plus, Mike can see inside Joe and Mary, since he can see their entirety. So this is using a 3D view of 2D reality. Mike being a 3D being, Joe and Mary being 2D beings. And again, we're going to use this analogy to reason up now to 4D beings and 3D beings. In a similar fashion, 4D Elohim can apparently see the entirety of any 3D object in the realm. People having near-death experiences report to being able to see people in their hospital rooms plus what is going on in other rooms. Judging from the extrapolation of the above illustration, if these people having these near-death experiences had more time to learn how to use their new ability, they would presumably not only be able to see those people and the earth, but also inside those people and the earth. As an aside, a reasonable deduction is that angels can look at people and see their internal spirit and immediately tell if someone is regenerate or not. Plus, angels, both fallen and unfallen, can probably get a good idea of the spiritual health or depth of the depravity of a person with just a glance at his or her spirit. Such suggestions have been posed by authors of Christian fiction, and I think they are on target. Now let's move up to another dimension and look at 3D cross-sections of a 3D cube. Proceeding now with our cross-section analogy, if you were to use a 3D plane to take a 3D cross-section of a 3D cube using that same orientation that was used to produce a triangle, you would get a truncated three-sided pyramid. And again, I'm posing New Jerusalem is a truncated pyramid, hence the illustration. After all, a 3D plane would have a top and a bottom, thus producing a truncated pyramid as its cross-section. In like fashion, if you were to create a cross-section of a 4D cube using a 3D plane, you evidently would be able to produce an infinite number of 3D truncated pyramids, like that of New Jerusalem. In an analogous manner, I pose that an infinite number of 3D truncated pyramidal cities can be used in 3D space to access the singular 4D cubical heavenly city. Since they are 3D pyramids, they would take up no space in the fourth dimension and could thus be infinite in their number. Let's use another illustration, the outside and the inside of a TARDIS. If it is objected that the cross-section of the 3D cubed picture is that of a three-sided pyramid, I would suggest that a cross-section of a 4D cube might accordingly render a four-sided pyramid. Also, these cross-section illustrations are intended to be taken analogously. I am more inclined to think that the real situation is something more akin to the TARDIS in the TV show Doctor Who. This spacecraft can take any desired shape on the outside, but has much more space on the inside. It can look like a telephone booth on the outside, for example, but if you open the door, you'll see a spaceship that is much larger than the outside. In the above illustration, part of the control room of the spaceship has been shown to help aid the imagination. In effect, I'm not only posing that the Heavenly Space City is a spaceship that accesses more internal space than is perceived on the outside, but that this spaceship can be replicated to produce many such spaceships that access the same internal space. In terms of the illustration, replicas of the original phone booth could be created to access the interior of the singular spaceship. For the sake of this analogy, in which I am using the TARDIS spaceship to illustrate New Jerusalem, I am not conceiving of the outside of the TARDIS as a dimensional interface to the immediate interior of the much larger spaceship that exists within it in its own dimensional pocket. Instead, I picture the outside as a transdimensional portal to the much larger ship that exists somewhere else in the same dimension and/or in a higher dimension. Opening the doors creates a portal that immediately accesses the remote interior of the ship. New Jerusalem may operate similarly. Entering the 3D city, which you see on the left, may give you simultaneous access to the 4D city and movement within it. The 4D city might be accessed through multiple copies of the 3D city. For example, picture multiple people entering 3D copies of New Jerusalem and going to attend a dinner party in the same location in the 4D New Jerusalem. There's New Jerusalem at the lower left, 3D copies, people moving within. The 3Ds also gives them access and movement within the 4D city in the upper right. The 3Ds are homes of the second-tier human gods and goddesses, while New Jerusalem is the home of the bridal first-tier human gods and goddesses. Let's take a trip from 3D New Jerusalem through a wormhole to the 4D city. Along the way, we will observe 3D cities on the outside of the wormhole that are the capitals of other galaxies. There's New Jerusalem. We're leaving it to take a trip through the wormhole in our trip to the 4D city. As humanity grows and spreads infinitely throughout the galaxies, the gods and goddesses in New Jerusalem will need infinite access to those 3D galaxies over which they administer, posing an infinite increase in the number of 3D copies of New Jerusalem that are accessible from New Jerusalem via wormholes to and from those 3D copied cities and administered by second-tier gods and goddesses, offers a plausible model that is consistent with biblical affirmations that God instructs His servants to make 3D copies of the heavenly city. The 4D city can act as the hub of this wormhole travel within this multiverse wide web. Let's look at different types of space. Superspace, for example. Superstring theory was created to explain the smallest particles and forces. In like manner, I am posing my own version of superspace theory to explain the largest space and forces in the dynamic relationship between supernatural and natural intelligences. Contrary to the popular persuasion that God exists outside of time, I believe that God exists in a superspace-time continuum that permeates the hyperspace-time continuum in which angels in the 4D city reside, which in turn permeates the space-time continuum in which humans and the earth reside. So looking briefly at some of the illustrations I have in the book, here's a 5D view of 4D. My preference is to use timelines to picture God as existing outside of our time, but not outside of time altogether. Reasoning by analogy leads to the same conclusion. Earthlings are 3D beings who reside in 3D space. Angels are a higher order of beings, namely 4D beings, who reside in 4D hyperspace. In turn, since angels were created in the image of God, and since humans were created in the image of God and angels, see my book Misthological Sex in Heaven, it stands to reason that God is a higher order of being, presumably at least a 5D being who resides in 5D superspace. As such, standing in his 5D universe, Jesus can take a 5D view of 4D angels, the 4D lake of fire, and of our 4D multiverse with its internal 3D universes. Dimensionally, angels are higher beings than us because they natively operate in the 4D dimension, while we only natively operate in the 3rd dimension. They are native to the 4th dimension, while we are native to the 3rd dimension. Our design and nature are tied ontologically to our dimensionality. Reasoning by analogy would lead us to think that because God is likewise superior to angels, He natively exists and operates in a higher dimension than them. Accordingly, the above illustration perceives Jesus as standing in the 5th dimension where He can see the lower dimensions. We should reasonably infer that the Lord, by nature, is ontologically at least a 5th degree being. 2 Peter states, according to His promise, we are looking for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. I do not believe that the lake of fire will be in the same space or hyperspace as that occupied by the new heavens or new earth in the eternal state. Again, Peter said that righteousness would dwell in the new heavens and new earth. So I do not believe that the lake of fire will be there. So there's the lake of fire burning away. Nor do I believe that the lake of fire will be in the subspace of the new heavens and new earth. The lake of fire will not be in our basement, so to speak. Instead, I believe the lake of fire is outside the kingdom of heaven, and thus outside our 4D universe, thus outside the multiverse. All sin will be removed from our 4D universe and moved to this 4D prison. The lake of fire is a 4D prison outside of our 4D universe. In the eternal state, redeemed humanity might be able to view the lake of fire via a teleportal if the lake of fire is viewable from outside earthly Jerusalem, as some believe. I've pictured Jesus as standing in this 5D superspace. The bride will co-rule with Him. So where do we put the bride in the illustration? I'll pause here a moment and you think about that. Do we put the bride with Jesus? Do we put the bride down with the angels? Where? So let's consider, do we put the bride beside him? That would be a very questionable location. I say it's wrong. No, Jesus cannot raise the bride completely to his level. Ontologically, God must remain the uppermost Elohim, capital E. Perceiving Jesus as existing at least one plane higher than the bride seems to be theologically necessary. One might speculate that God can move up into another dimension if he moves the bride up to his current position. Yet that supposition is confounded by biblical propositions about the immutability of God's chainless nature, such as Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today, yes, and forever. And for I, the Lord, do not change. Again, restate this. Ontology seems to be intrinsically connected with dimensionality. So let's take a 6D view of 5D, with Jesus standing outside the 5D in 6D space. At a minimum, Jesus is a fifth dimensional being, but he could be higher. Why not allow the possibility that he can elevate the bride to be a fifth dimensional being if he is a higher order of being than 5D? After all, would it not make sense for him to do so if he could? And if he could, would he not do so? All things are possible for God. What I am posing certainly seems to fall within the category of possibility, and if it is a possibility, then certain considerations lead me to consider it a probability. In this illustration, the 5D bride is viewing the 4D angels and 4D multiverse below, while Jesus is standing above, outside that 5D time, seeing both the 5D bride and the 4D reality she is seeing. The bride is, after all, ontologically a higher order of being than angels. Therefore, since ontology is tied to dimensionality, you would suspect that she would be a higher dimensional order of being. Since the bride of Christ is ontologically superior to angels, she probably more fully shares God's nature in terms of dimensionality than angels. She not only has something angels do not have, a regenerate nature, God's nature. She has this nature at an elevated Misthological status that is higher than the rest of regenerate humanity. Surely the bride, as the first-tier Elohim, will have a nature that is further ontologically and dimensionally elevated than all other regenerate humanity. Her ontological superiority argues powerfully for dimensional superiority, which in turn suggests that the Lord is actually at least a 6D being. After all, the Lord must be at least one level higher than the bride. Bridal believers will be like him, but not identical to him. So let's take a 6D view of 5D from supernal space. Following through on the probable inference that Jesus is at least a 6D being, we can picture Jesus as standing in a 6D dimension in which he sees the bride in her 5D reality. After all, he must have somewhere to stand outside her dimension, since he is not limited to her dimensionality. He would be in a higher dimension from which he could view and access her dimensionality. The proposition that the bride's nature is ontologically and mythologically superior to angels and the rest of regenerate humanity is deductively certain. Consequently, the proposition that her nature is dimensionally superior to angels is reasonable. Let's take a look at the theological twilight zone with its spatial implications. Revelation 21:24-26 says, "And the nations will walk by its light," talking about the light of New Jerusalem, "and the kings of the earth will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it." That would be the nations on earth. They're going to bring them into New Jerusalem. "And its gates," that is the gate of the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, "will never be shut during the day, and there will be no night there. And they will bring the glory and honor of the nations," that would be the earthly nations, "into it," that is the heavenly city, "in order that they may enter it," that is the heavenly city. The 3D city, pictured by John, will be buzzing with ceaseless business activity. As suggested previously, one way the kings of the earth will bring their cargo into the satellite city is by means of its gates, portals. These portals can be accessed by spaceships and ziggurats, and will be bustling with infinite activity day and night from all over the multiverse. An obvious thing to be noted about the size of the city in relation to the planet is that the city is smaller than the planet. The kings and the nations will be outside the city on the planet below. Millennial believers will not qualify to be part of the bride, even if they are not rebellious. Consequently, they will not live in the heavenly city. Nevertheless, they can qualify for positions of responsibility in the terrestrial realm. We may further postulate that some of them will become kings of the earth. They will be the terrestrial kings who do not live in the heavenly city. I would consider this somewhat of a mythological twilight zone. My theory is that semi-faithful premillennial immortals, faithful millennial mortals, and faithful eternal smortals might qualify for low-ranking ruling positions in the terrestrial realm and constitute the kings of the various terrestrial planets, such as Earth, during the eternal state. Ruling smortals can eventually qualify to become second-tier ruling immortals. Smortals is my coined term for humans in natural flesh and blood bodies who are sinless, semi-transformed, sexually reproducing, semi-mortal. Again, this is explained much more thoroughly in the book. Let's look briefly at the tree of life. Just as the leaves of the tree of life, which grow inside the city, may be shared with those who live in the nations outside the city, so the water of life may be freely accessed outside the city. For the water flows down the middle of the streets, through the 12 gates, to the nations outside the city. Some suggest that the tree of life is a forest of trees. Others believe the river is in the middle of the tree. Others think that the tree is in the middle of the river. Others picture the tree along the banks of the river. Possibly a single tree taken from the Garden of Eden thousands of years ago and transplanted at the top of the heavenly Jerusalem grew along the banks. This tree has now grown progressively for thousands of years. It has a massive root structure that sinks deep into the rich soils along the banks of the river of the water of life, where the tree continues to grow and spread. It has formed groves and parks as well as lining the main roads. In addition to being on the outside slope of the city walls, the tree and the water of life probably pervade the inside of the city as well. The city would be a virtual greenhouse. So here I picture the tree of life by the river of life. John says, "Then he showed me a river, the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, the tree of life ran along both sides of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding a different kind each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." A single massive tree, interconnected by a single root structure that is spread along all banks of the river, is envisioned. The river and tree both have one point of origin, the throne of God at the top of the city, and again this city is 1,500 miles high. Outside looking in, so here's one of the gates of the city with the street and the water and tree of life coming out to the gate. How can access to the water of life be granted freely without cost if it is inside the city and access to the city is limited to overcomers? Posing that the water flows freely outside the gates provides one possible answer. In that case, the question naturally rises, to where does the water flow? The suggestion I posed in my book, The Outer Darkness, is that it flows into portals. In the case of the 4D city, the water would flow out of the gate to the surrounding land. Part of it would return to the subterranean basin, part of it would flow to other planets in the celestial realm via means of portals. What about the 3D city, which is a satellite city? This picture presents a possible answer to that question. I would pose that all of the living water flows into portals in that case. Each gate would have a portal, or each gate could create a waterfall that falls into the portal at the bottom of the biosphere. Spaceships could dock at the city gates to access the street while the water flows to the portal or portals below. Something of this nature is suggested by the movies Thor and Avatar. Do a Google search for the images of Asgard waterfall. The planet Asgard is flat and surrounded by waterfalls. The water running under the crystal bridge in Asgard flows into the sea of space. That aspect of Asgard is comparable to my 3D city and its waterfalls. Also do a Google image search and YouTube video search for waterfalls in the floating mountains of Pandora. Where does the water come from? It takes a little imagination to picture these floating mountains or waterfalls to be reminiscent of the heavenly mountain floating with waterfalls. The city will be accessed by both portals and spaceships. I envisioned the water of life flowing outside the 12 gates in the eternal state, creating waterfalls with teleportals at their basins to transport the water freely to the nations outside the gates on the planet below. Let's look at the 4D city with the subterranean water. And again, this is explained much more thoroughly in my previous book, Misthological Models Part 4, and is recapped in my book, Misthological Models Part 5. As to the flat nature of Asgard, compare it with the picture of the flat planet Paradise used for the 4D city and the water beneath it. Asgard is fiction, of course. There's its picture, well done in the movie. It's a fictional flat planet with water running off and forming waterfalls around it, which is fictionally meant to portray heaven. My 4D model, in contrast, is not fiction, but based on eyewitness testimony. Nevertheless, the Asgard imagery is well done in the movie and combines my 3D and 4D models. What I am posing is Planet Paradise as a factual flat planet that has the 4D city and has rivers of life flowing from the city to the water of life in the subterranean basin. For further information, you can see my website, accessible through either of these links, mythology.org, unconditionalsecurity.org, theouterdarkness.org. If you'll click on printed books, it'll take you to my webpage where you can find my books. The book being surveyed with this video is predominantly Misthological Models Part 5. You can click on the title at the top to obtain a PDF copy, or you can click on the cover for a printed book or a Kindle version.